Thank you so much for taking the time to do this call with me. I'm Simone, as I mentioned in the LinkedIn message. I got into storytelling through music, so I was doing music and performing when I was very young, but recently I've been going to open mics and doing performances every week, and that's how I got into storytelling. Okay.
Good morning.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this with me.
I'm more than happy to.
Yeah, and I'm so sorry for your loss, and I just want to say once again, I'm really grateful for you to take the time out of your schedule and your day to, do this interview with me.
Well, thank you. And yeah, I am more than happy to meet with you. Just my schedule's just been a little wonky and my mind's been a little fuzzy. So sorry for all the back and forth. Usually it's not that complicated. So So tell me a little about yourself.
I'm Simone, as I mentioned in the email. I got into storytelling through music because I was always singing and doing that since I was very young. And I wonder if I think my video's kind of... Is my video okay on your side?
It's lagging a little bit, but I kind of thought it was my side. But I can hear you perfectly fine.
Okay. I can rejoin to see if that would be better. So I can do that real quick.
Okay.
She seems really nice though, so that's really nice. Okay, I'm so sorry about that. So, as I was saying, I'm Simone, and I've gotten into storytelling through music, and that's where I've always kind of had that passion for music. So recently I've been going to open mics, and I would perform every week. And through this, that's where I discovered, creating that bond with my audience is what was really important, and trying to establish that emotional connection was also something that was really important. So that's where I also got into storytelling. Even when you're talking, you kind of have to do the same thing. like creating that bond with your audience and get them engrossed in your speech as well. So that's kind of how I got into storytelling.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so um, I actually found you through an article because I was researching a bunch of articles on storytelling, and I found one of them, and I was kind of curious, right? Because it was an experiment that you guys did, right, with this specific
Yep.
learning community.
Mm-hmm.
So, how much like quantifiable improvement has this new way of learning shown in comparison to previous years? If you've done this more in the future.
I think the level of learning we really can't quantify for a couple of different reasons. First, the population is really small, so statistically it would be insignificant. And then also to quantify it, we would have to more formally define what we mean by learning, right? Because in higher education, we quite often focus on formal assessment. So learning is always documented by a series of what we call learner outcomes based on the course objectives. But we also know intuitively that learning, right, takes place outside of what the course says the student must learn. So I don't think there's a way of clearly quantifying it. I think we can maybe qualify like more of the engagement part because we connect through our stories, right? It's what makes us relate to one another. We are the sum of our experiences and our stories. So once students start understanding that their experiences can be validated in the classroom, then I think it raises their confidence and they're more apt to participate. So, logic dictates if they participate more, then they're going to learn more. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, if that logic kind of maps out clearly or not.
No, I kind of understand that. As I was reading through your article, I saw that the cross-cultural competence was increased from 5.48 to 6.03. So I actually came up with this idea called Charismafy, which is a database of a bunch of stories that are easy to access, that are on demand. They're just simple stories with morals in them, and that vary from so many different cultures. So, do you think if a student were to use Charismafy in school, or how much value do you think they would get from that?
I think they would get a lot. I'm not familiar with that particular database, but I use books that are anthologies, collections of short stories. And in fact, I teach a humanities course where it's supposed to be humanities through the lens of literature. And I've actually taken out the novel section. It's poetry, short stories, drama, and it's supposed to be a novel. And I've taken the novel out and replaced it with a nonfiction, full-length nonfiction book called No Choir Boys. I started using it maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and students just really gravitate towards it. So looping back to your question, I think anytime students are exposed to true stories that give them insight to other ways of living, learning, other experiences, I think a lot of our students, at least at the institution where I work, because I'm conservative New Hampshire, our school attracts a local population. We're predominantly white, we're predominantly middle class. So our students don't typically come into school having experiences outside of that predominantly white, middle class, conservative New England point of view. So whether they're using the database that you're talking about, or short stories or full-length manuscripts, any exposure is going to automatically make them less ethnocentric. It gets them out of their local space.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. In your past experiences as a professor and when you communicate with your students, do you use stories in your presentations?
I do. And it's actually been received with mixed results, interestingly.
Oh,
The teacher viewpoint is I'm sharing this little piece of my life to let you know that I can relate to your experiences, or hopefully you can relate to my experiences, but I've had this experience. I'm not, the traditional sage on the stage where I'm just giving you information that I've never experienced or that I haven't lived. So that's the purpose, but it's not always received that way. So I've had to be very, very careful. I will tend to ask the class, do you want me to share this story with you? Because I have been accused on evaluations. And in fact, the course that's in the article that you're referring to, this came up on my evaluations, that there was too much about the teacher. It was too much about her.
okay.
She just wanted to talk about personal stories. And I was like, well, it's a personal storytelling class. There's probably a reason why I'm focusing on all the stories.
Yeah.
The irony, it's like teaching a writing class and getting feedback, well, there was too much writing. So I have to be really careful in how I present my stories. And I try really hard to make sure that I do it more in moderation. I always have a conversation of the purpose ahead of time. And I'll give them, basically the option to opt out. Well, I know I mentioned such and such yesterday. If you want to hear about this, I'll share it with you. If you guys are kind of over it, we can move on to something else. Because it can, as much as I believe in it as a teaching methodology, it's not always interpreted the way that we mean it to happen in the classroom.
Okay. Yeah, so that was actually something new that I learned, as you were saying, because I kind of always thought like, oh, using stories is good, but like I guess some people have a different perspective on that, like, oh, you're talking about yourself too much. So, do you think having like short stories on demand that would that have like simple morals to them that teach smaller lessons, do you think those would also be beneficial, or do you think it's more about, your personal stories?
I think it's both. The downside of using outside stories is that we can never fully put ourselves in those shoes.
Yeah.
So I do the privilege walk. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the privilege walk but essentially students line up in a straight row. You ask them a series of questions. Based on their answer, they either take a step forward or a step back. Okay. And so they all start on an equal line, but based on their answers, they end up pretty much scattered, forwards and backwards. And it's to talk about privilege. And there's a YouTube video on it. You can actually look up the privilege walk on YouTube if you kind of want to see it in practice. In the YouTube video, the person who ends up at the very, very back ends up being, I think, forgive me if my it's been a while. My memory may be a little fuzzy on it, but I think she's a bisexual, maybe homosexual, bisexual Black woman. And she sort of ends up way behind everybody else in the group in this privilege walk. There is a powerful story there to share, but the problem is, as a teacher, I am not a bisexual Black woman. I can't speak to that story. So when we discuss that story in a classroom,
Mm-hmm.
I can certainly bring a certain perspective to it. I can come at it from a feminist approach. I can use, being a woman, using that lens, but that's all I have. And so
Right.
when we use our personal stories, when students are open and comfortable to ask hard questions, we can give authentic answers when we're talking about the stories that we've lived.
Mm-hmm.
So, coming back to your original question, I think it's a little of both. I think there's
Mm-hmm.
a benefit, like I said, being exposed to multiple points of views, multiple walks of life,
Yeah.
but we be careful how we facilitate those conversations because we haven't lived it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I think it's kind of hard to relate to something if you haven't, gone through that yourself. So after, that learning community finished their courses, were there any, stories that really stuck with you and that, that have changed or shaped your life, maybe made you a different person than you were before, or just kind of changed you in a different way?
I think it validated a lot of what I felt in the classroom. I think it validated a lot of the lack of confidence that students have. My culminating project at the end of that course and another course I teach are digital stories.
Mm-hmm.
So students are required to craft 4 to 5 minute stories. The subject matter differs a little bit depending on the course. But in that course, they were asked to put together, basically a digital story about themselves
Mm-hmm.
and their place in the world at that moment in time. And they were incredibly reluctant to do that. There was a huge lack of confidence that students, for whatever reason, whether it's a generational thing, whether it's an upbringing thing, I don't know. But students traditionally bring a lack of confidence into the classroom. Like their stories don't matter. I teach professional writing and business communications, and I'll have students be like, well, I don't have any professional skills. I only work at McDonald's. I'm like, there's no only in front of McDonald's, right? That's a fast paced environment. You have accuracy. If you're on the front counter, you've got to deal with customer service and complaints. If you're out back, you're, constantly on this rapid fire food prep. There's organizational skills, there's time management, there's customer service. Like you're building all of these skills. Is it a minimum wage job? Perhaps, but that doesn't undervalue the experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I think coming out of that course, it validated and really brought to light. They were so unwilling to share their personal stories. And then also the tremendous amount of hurt and struggling and pain that is represented in our current student generation. We're dealing with things. I'm going into my 30th year of teaching in the fall. And, I sound like I'm 106 when I start using phrases like, well, when I was in college, right? I never wanted to be that person to use that phrase. But I'm serious when I say when I was in college, we weren't worried about having food pantries on our campuses because we have so many students who have food insecurity. The tremendous amount of struggle, the debt, the time management. In my generation, it was, do you have a job while you're a student? Now the question is, what job or jobs do you have as a student?
Right.
And I think one of the things that came out of that course is the tremendous amount of difficulties, challenges, suffering that our students go through and the sacrifice that they make to be in college.
Yeah.
And that had definitely a long-term impact on me.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I kind of relate a little bit because it's kind of hard to share a lot of stories about yourself. I mean, it's kind of easier to talk about all these other topics that maybe you don't care about as much, but I guess it's hard to like open up in front of other classmates in the fear of kind of being judged and being looked at. So, all of these stories, whether they be personal or just generic, equally still impactful stories, if they're as powerful as they are, and since you've had firsthand experience of that, do you think that they are not commonly used? And if not, then why?
Stories not commonly used among students or among teachers or both?
Both.
I think there's a reluctance of storytelling with students, again, for the lack of confidence and the fear of being judged. I think faculty.
Okay.
That's a really great question. I'm mulling that over in my head.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think with faculty members, there's a reluctance, I think, to use stories in terms of time. I have